In this video, I'm going to show you how to make things look wonky in Blender and to give your models a more handcrafted look. The goal is to create a customizable modifier that we can simply drag and drop onto our meshes. I use this technique all the time to add a wonky handmade feel, make procedural textures loop seamlessly, or simply add some subtle irregularity to static meshes to make them more interesting. Now this is a great lesson in two main areas. First, how to make procedural textures loop seamlessly. And second, how to build your very own geometry nodes tools from scratch to make them more user-friendly or to reuse them over and over again in your own project. Now I get it. When you're new to nodes or Blender in general, nodes can feel very overwhelming. It might feel like everyone magically knows what each node does or where each node goes. But don't worry, this is really only the beginning. Nodes are pretty similar to programming, so you have to get used to the whole workflow. And you will see that most setups use the same core principles over and over again. But hey, if this sounds too boring for you and you want to skip the next 12-ish minutes, that's totally fine. You can download the finished tool from my Ko-fi page. I'll put the link in the description. But if you're up for it and you want to learn something new, stick around. I'll break the whole thing down step by step and I'll show you exactly how you can create your very own geometry nodes modifier. So let's dive in. On this model, I will create a new modifier in the modifier panel and I will give it a name. I like descriptive names, so I'll go with wonky nodes. Then in the geometry nodes editor over here, I will zoom in a bit to see the nodes a bit better. Now, the basis for our whole node setup is the set position node. What this node does is fairly simple. It pushes all points in one certain direction, X, Y, or Z. We can actually use a noise texture to displace the individual points of our mesh. For this, add a noise texture node and plug the color output into the offset. After the noise texture, add a vector math node set to subtract and set its values to 0.5. This centers our displacement. Then add another vector math node by duplicating it and set it to multiply, which gives us a slider to control the displacement strength. You could stop here if you just wanted static displacement without any controls. However, I'd like to make it more user-friendly. We can do this by exposing specific node values in the modifier panel, which lets us adjust settings without going into the geometry nodes editor all the time. Duplicate the group input node. Connect the empty output to the vector input. Press N on your keyboard to see the group settings in the end panel. For instance, I want just one value to control the strength instead of fiddling around with 3 values all at once. I changed the type from vector to float and rename the socket to strength. I'll set the default value to 0.1 and check the single value checkbox. This lets us control the strength directly from outside the geometry nodes editor. To keep things tidy, I'll hide the unused geometry input sockets by pressing H on the keyboard. Next, I will duplicate the node again by pressing Shift D and I will connect the empty socket to the scale value. I will rename the input to noise scale. Next, I'd like to make the noise animatable. For this, I will change the dimension of the noise from 3D to 4D. This will give us a W value, which allows us to animate the noise. Now you could just keyframe this value and fiddle around with the keyframes to make it loopable. But here I'd like to make it procedural. So add a scene time node and connect the frame output to the W input. If we hit play now, the noise just goes nuts, because we're feeding it integer frame numbers directly into W. To slow things down, I'll add a math node set to multiply and set the value to 0.01. This makes our animation 100 times slower. Now the texture is moving in a much calmer way. However, there's a catch. I'll do a lot of looping animations, so I'd like the texture to loop seamlessly. Currently this isn't happening. Every time we hit the end of the timeline, the texture simply resets. This next step might seem a bit daunting or mathy when you look at the nodes, but it's actually pretty simple. It's a bit tricky for me to visualize, but think of it like this. We start with a procedural noise texture that, by default, would continue infinitely. To make it loop, we use a floored modular node with our frame count as value. In this case, 60. This ensures that the noise texture starts at frame 0 and resets cleanly at the end of our timeline, instead of cutting off abruptly. Now if we take these apart, we basically blend two noise textures together, using a mix color node with a divide math node controlling the transition. This gradually shifts from one texture to another, creating a seamless loop over our defined timeline. So I will duplicate the math node and I will set it to floored modulo. Set the value to the number of frames in your timeline. I currently have 60. With floor modulo, when the frame count reaches 60, it resets cleanly to 0. This ensures that our noise animation matches perfectly at the start and end of the loop. Next, I will duplicate the noise texture with the multiply node, and I will mix these two noise textures together. To achieve that, add a mix color node and connect the bottom noise texture to the B socket and the top one to the A socket of the mix color node. With the factor slider, we can now blend between these two nodes. Next, I will duplicate the modulo node and I will set it to subtract. I will connect it to the top input of the second multiply node. Then duplicate the subtract node and set it to divide. Connect the result of the floored modulo node to the divide node. Make sure that the bottom value of the modulo node, the subtract node and the divide node are all congruent with the end number here. If I connect now the divide node to the factor node of the mixed color node and hit play, we have a looping texture. To make things more user-friendly again, I'd like to expose these frame numbers, so we can easily change them. Add a group input node and connect it to the modulo node. In the end panel, rename it to loop frames and change the default to 250, because this is the default in vanilla Blender. Set the minimum to 0 and let the maximum at this, and again check the single value. To keep things organized, we can create collapsible panels in the modifier. I'll create one called Animation and drag the value into it. We have two options here, either connect the value to all corresponding value sockets or copy it as I'm doing. Neither approach is wrong, it's just different workflows. I prefer copying the input nodes and hiding the inputs since it keeps the node tree cleaner and more readable if, for example, I want to change things in the future. Next, I want to add directional control to our displacement, letting us choose between affecting all directions or just one specific axis. Add a menu switch node and set its type to vector. In the end panel, create a new panel called Noise and drag and drop all noise related settings there. Connect the group to the menu socket, move it into the panel and name it Direction. In the node settings, create 4 menu options: Normal, X, Y and Z. Connect the normal output from the multiply vector node to the normal input of the menu switch node. Let's create some space for our node tree. Add a separate XYZ node and a combine XYZ node. For the X direction, connect only the X value to the X input of the menu switch. Duplicate these nodes twice and connect them to the remaining directions and the menu switch node. Perfect, now we have control over which direction the displacement actually affects. Another useful feature is to add a seed value, which allows us to generate different variations of the noise pattern by simply changing a number. To create this, add a math node set to add between the multiply node and the noise texture node. Create another group input node and connect it to the value socket of the add node. Rename it in the end panel to seed and change the type to integer. I drag and drop the seed socket into the noise panel, so everything regarding the noise is nicely grouped together. Duplicate the math node and the group input node and connect it the same way as we did above. Now we can input a seed value and get a different noise pattern per integer. Now I want to add actually a feature that toggles the animation on and off, for cases where I just want to add some wonkiness to my mesh without any animation. Let's add a switch node after the mix color node and change its type from geometry to color. Connect the mix node's result to the true value. For the false value, duplicate the noise and the math add nodes, then connect the noise texture's color output to the false color's input. Set the value on the add node to 1. Add a group input node and connect the switch boolean to it. Drop it into the animation panel and rename the switch to boil animation. Now we have a single checkbox that allows us to enable or disable the animation. Since I love creating handcrafted looks in 3D, I want to include stepped animation. In 2D animation, animators often work on 2s, 3s or 4s. This means each keyframe is being held for 2, 3 or 4 frames, instead of creating a new frame every time, like our noise texture currently does. This technique makes the animation less smooth, but it creates a handcrafted feel. To do this, add a menu switch node, put it also in the animation panel and rename the sockets in the node settings to steps and keyframe. Add a math node and set it to snap. Add another group input node, connect it to the increment socket, rename it to step in the end panel, set the type from float to integer, and set the default to 4 and the min value to 2. Connect the nodes as you can see on screen. And drag and drop the step socket into the animation panel. If we change the steps in the modifier from 0 to, let's say, 4, we can see that we have now nice choppy animation. To control the speed of the noise, add a group input node and a math node. Change the type to divide and set the value to 100. Connect them, and in the end panel rename the socket to noise speed and change the default value to 1 and the min to 0. Drag it also in the animation panel and connect the divide math node to the bottom value sockets of these two multiply nodes. Now we can change the speed of our noise here in the modifier panel. Now we're almost done. The last thing I'd like to add is a way to set a mask, in case we only want to apply this effect to a specific part of the mesh. And it's super simple. Add another group input node and plug it into the selection socket of the set position node we added all the way back at the beginning. Rename it to mask in the end panel and drag it into a new panel called mask. I set the panel to be closed by default since I don't often need a mask, which helps to declutter the modifier. Now, the way vertex groups are handled will probably change in the near future here in Blender, and I will update the setup on my Ko-fi page. For now, you can select parts of your mesh in edit mode, assign vertices to a new group, and select or assign it in our modifier. Now, to make it reusable, I want it to show up in the asset browser here. To do that, we have to tell Blender that it's actually an asset. For this, change the display mode of the outliner to Blender file and navigate down to node groups. Right-click on the node group and click Mark Asset. Now it will show up as an asset in the asset browser. In the end panel, you can provide additional information like tags or a description. You can also set a preview image. I just rendered out a thumbnail here. Now you can simply drag and drop the wonky nodes modifier onto our mesh. You can also catalog your assets if you have many different ones. Create a catalog and drag and drop the asset into it. To use it in any file, go to Edit, Preferences. Under File Paths, you can define your asset library path or multiple ones. This would also be the folder where you would put my file from the Ko-fi page. Copy this path and save your file in this directory. Now you can use it in any project by just drag and dropping it onto your objects. And that wraps up this simple geometry nodes tutorial. I hope this gave you a good understanding of how you can come up with your own tools. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or if there's anything specific that you want to see covered in a future video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.